All right, so I wanted to just make a quick video to show how to do the analysis for the pop-up lab. I know a couple of you are having some trouble with it, so I'm just gonna run through it really quick. Um, just to help you finish up your lab report. So in the lab, we had to figure out the the spring concept for the spring. So the concept basically was as follows. The spring was compressed some distance, and then afterwards the spring jumped up like so, and we measured the height change from the beginning position to the upper position. That was the height. And you should have measured the compression distance from here to here. That would be our, displacement from equilibrium, because we can write potential energy is equal to mgh at the highest point over here. And this potential energy is going to be equal to 1/2 kx squared down over here. Well, really technically down there, right? So then we just can solve for it. You'd write mgh is equal to 1/2 kx squared. Solve for k, so it would be 2mgh, cancels out the half, equals kx squared, divide the x squared on both sides. So you get the spring constant k. It's just going to be equal to 2 times the mass times the g times the h divided by x squared. So I borrowed one of the students' data they analyzed. Now what I got here is a bunch of trials and heights, but I have to go see where they posted the x value and the the mass, because we need to have the mass and we need to have the displacement. So bear with me just a second. I'm just going to pause the video. All right, so there was some information that was missing before I paused the recording. I was missing the mass of the individual, the little toy itself, and I've converted it down here to kilograms. And then we need the compression distance as well. So basically the idea is to find the spring constant. You put in your potential energy due to gravity, double it, and divide it by the displacement squared, and that'll give you the k value, right? So it's easy enough with these values to figure this out, right? So I'm taking some data. The first thing I need to do is, these are height data, right? The height data. And this data is the same data as the above data, but I just put it in one big long column, makes it easier to analyze it. Then to find the individual spring constants, right? So spring constant. What do I mean by the individual spring constants is basically each one of these trials, you could associate a spring constant with it. None of them are the correct spring constant, but it gives you an understanding of the spread of spring constant, because basically mass doesn't change, g doesn't change, the x doesn't change. The only thing that changes in the situation is the height, right? So let's define our variables. Let's fix this. So this should be like, whenever you do this in Excel, you want to make sure to keep them in separate boxes. So the mass is in kilograms. And it's 0.0092, and then the x value is equal to 0.02 in meters. And then once we have this, we have to name this. So I'm just going to call this thing the mass. So when you name it, it basically Excel knows you're going to use that same number over and over again. This one we'll call the x value. And then we also need G, which is not that hard, 9.81. I'll call that graph. That's easy enough, right? So to find the spring constant, it's an equal sign. I'm just going to write this equation in Excel. It's 2 times the mass times G times the height. And the height, oops, I forgot something. The height, I need another column. So I'm just going to pause that for a second. This height has to be measured in meters. And of course, you never want to put in units in the boxes in Excel because it actually makes it harder to do the math. So it's 0.6, 0.54, 0.55, 0.57, 0.57, 0.52, 0.50, 0.54, 0.55, 0.54, 0.55, 0.61, 6.56, 0.52, 0.64, 0.58, 0.58, 0.63, 0.53, right? We got to have those in meters, otherwise it won't work. Let's fix this again, right? So it equals 2 times the mass times G times the height. And then we divide all that bit, put in parentheses to make sure it's divided properly. Divide it by the x value raised to the second power. And it gives us a spring constant of 270 for the first trial, 270 newtons per meter. Double click, and for each one of these trials now I can get the whole spring constant, right? So now I could find the average. This equals the average. Here's the average height. And I can do that also for this column over here. And there we go. We got the average spring constant, right? Now that doesn't give me the standard deviation. To find the standard deviation, I know this is probably what we've been waiting for all this time. You just label it standard deviation, then go to the equal sign, then start typing standard. Now you have to choose which one, right? So there's standard deviation based on the entire population, which is not really true for this case. This is a sample, right? So you would use standard deviation based on a sample. And the sample is just this long group, this small group of data collection. So that's the function you use. And then you just highlight all the numbers that are the spring constant numbers. And so the standard deviation for the data set is 16. So for those of you that aren't sure what that means, let me show you an image of what I'm talking about. Right. Can I just copy this thing? I don't think I actually can just paste easily. So what we're going to do is just switch the view to the other view. Right. So this thing here is like the standard deviation curve for a normal distribution. So what it means is this 0 is like the average, right? Most of your trials should be about the average, and then standard deviation plus 1 standard deviation plus minus 1 standard deviation. that means that the most of your data set should fall within this range, like 68%, which is 34 plus 34, 68, 68.2% should be between -1 and +1 standard deviation. For this experiment, we'd like to make sure that we have more than just um, one standard deviation. We'll use 2 standard deviation as the margin of error, because that means that like this works out to be like 90 something percent of your data set. I mean, you could go crazy and go 3 sigma, but I think for our purposes, 2 standard deviations is fine. So once I've calculated the standard deviation, I would just say the um, the value would be, hang on a second, double is going to just be equal to take this number times 2. So then the answer, right, the spring constant, is going to be equal to 253.6 plus uh, or minus 33, right? By percent, that equals this. Where'd it go? Equals this divided by. So we basically, it's kind of like saying we have about 13% error in our measurements, meaning that we found the truth to be 253, but because the data set could be anywhere between -33 plus this and plus 33, it's about a 20 um, about a 26% swing back and forth, if that makes any sense. Okay, so I'm going to pause the recording now. Hopefully that helps figuring out the standard deviation.